So we'll get started on this last session of the conference. I want to congratulate all of you on your endurance in making it to session 8 of this conference. My name's Kathleen Wellman. I am an early modernist, delighted to spend some time this afternoon in the 20th and even the 21st century. And in this session, Contested Visions of Metropole and Colony, from France to French West Africa in the 20th century, you will be treated to a series of papers given by scholars who are on the verge of publishing important work on French colonial history. Our first speaker is Kathleen Keller, otherwise known as Kate. She's an assistant professor at Gustavus Adolphus. She received her PhD from Rutgers in 2007. Her published articles include On the Fringes of the Civilizing Mission, Suspicious Frenchmen, and Unofficial Discourses of French Colonialism in AOF, 1918 to 1939, in French Colonial History, published in 2008, and Political Surveillance and Colonial Urban Rule, Suspicious Politics and Urban Space in Dakar, Senegal, 1918 to 1939 in French Historical Studies, published in 2012. Her book, Manuscript in Progress, is Colonial Suspects, Suspicious Persons, and Police Surveillance in French West Africa, 1918 to 1939. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do today is start out by giving you a little bit of context about how and why I did this research project. Then I'm going to give you a brief overview of the results of my research, followed by some analysis. My research on colonial inspectors, the title of this paper, from which the title of this paper comes, is just one small piece of my book manuscript on suspicious persons and police surveillance in French colonial Africa. This research project uses the concept of suspicion and documents on suspicious persons to understand the colonial administration and society of French West Africa in the interwar era. Over the years, as I've presented my research on suspicious persons, I've been asked who conducted this surveillance, the surveillance that's at the heart of my research. And very often, my basic answer has been French policemen conducted the surveillance, which I know because I've identified their names in police reports. I've also deduced the fact that African informants were involved in surveillance, although not as official policemen. These Africans were not listed by name, and therefore I haven't been able to dig any deeper into their backgrounds so far. But even these preliminary answers haven't been satisfactory to me. I wanted to know who were the police, what were their backgrounds, was it possible that their education or politics could have shaped surveillance policies and practices. So I'm going to briefly summarize my research and argument on suspicious persons to give you the broader picture. During and following the First World War, police in French West Africa were involved in a surveillance project that monitored foreigners during the war, then so-called suspicious persons in the interwar period. These surveillance operations, promoted by the Ministry of Colonies and the government general seated in Dakar, reached into the complex and changing society of the Federation of French West Africa, Afrique Occidentale Française, AOF. Operating primarily in urban areas, mainly the capital cities of each colony, police inspectors, commissaires, and other local administrators investigated in detail the lives of hundreds of suspects who were, for various reasons, considered a threat to the French in Africa. My manuscript uses the concept of suspicion as a starting point to explore the administration of the Federation of French West Africa and the emergence of an international urban culture in the interwar era. At first glance, it seems that suspicious activity might be synonymous with anti-colonialism. However, the diversity among suspects and their lives tells us that much more was at stake in building the category of suspect. The suspects in their lives tell us that the category was used to define a set of behaviors, activities, and groups that deviated from expectations of colonial authorities, so deviating from expected norms. Some of the suspects were communist or radical activists but many others were charlatans, frauds, eccentric travelers, or otherwise people considered out of place. They were African and French, but they were also foreigners. In the interwar era, authorities claimed to be fighting anti-imperialism. I argue that they were constructing the category of suspect to fight other very real changes taking place in a society that was breaking free of the bonds of stagnant and illusionary categories that supposedly ruled colonial life. Static categories might be citizen subject or French African. These categories were becoming less useful, I argue, and suspect became a new category to describe those people who seemed especially threatening to colonial society. Although the administrators in Dakar and officials in Paris helped establish the profile of a suspect in terms of activities ranging from communism and socialism to syndicalism, royalism, and extensive travel, police inspectors conducted surveillance. Police reports communicated information to lieutenant governors and governors general to scrutinize the lives of suspects. So in this paper, I turn to the lives of the policemen to ask about their identities as well. My question here is, who were the police? And my methodology is explained in greater detail in the pre-circulated paper. But just to briefly explain, I'm using 8 personnel files of policemen for our purposes here. There are people that I was able to identify by name, and that's why there's that limit. So I'm going to give us a kind of summary of what was in my paper regarding my research on the police. The men who served as colonial inspectors were not technically administrators in the colonial service. Instead, they were police. In fact, they were all Frenchmen who had previously served in different policing roles in metropolitan France before joining the police in AOF. For example, Abel Tournois had been a special inspector at the Prefect of Police in Paris since 1913. In 1922, he took up duties as inspector of police in AOF until 1937, at which point he was reintegrated into Paris Judicial Police. So they're really just moving from one prefect of police to another, in this case into French West Africa. Each police official was deployed from his home prefect for a particular time period, usually 3 years, and then it was reintegrated into his home prefect, but that cycle could happen again and again. So the 3-year contract could be renewed several times. Charles Moret, for example, retired and soon after died in 1940 at the age of 44 due to chronic malaria, liver problems, and other ailments he suffered during his overseas service. The training and experience of police inspectors was limited to their role as policemen. Unlike administrators who might have studied at the École Coloniale, personnel files of police give no evidence that they trained in areas relevant to understanding the societies they were living in or colonial administration in general. Although there is evidence that they did some continuing education in police work, so in photography or something like that, some kind of skill relevant to policing. Prior education is listed as primary in almost all cases. Gaston Brod is the exception, who completed secondary education up to the baccalaureate. Previous employment before entering the police in France also indicates modest backgrounds. Among listed prior employments are farmer, cook, and railroad employee. One exception, again, Gaston Brod. He was an expert accountant for the Crédit Lyonnais. Not surprisingly, under the category of fortune, for every policeman it was listed as blank or none. Most of the men were married, although 3 were divorced, one of whom remarried twice. Military service, not surprisingly, was the common denominator, especially service in the First World War. The average age of the men upon entry into colonial service was in their late 20s. Politics were usually described as, quote, the family does not concern itself with politics, unquote, or no politics, or politics were described as correct. One person had their politics described as Republican. All accounts indicate that the policemen self-selected for deployment to colonial police service in West Africa. Documents show that in 1922, Charles Moret and Dorothée Morer both personally solicited employment as police inspectors in AOF. Gaston Brod, after serving for 8 years in Dakar, returned to Paris in 1940 only to request to return to AOF once again. All right, so why did these policemen choose to go overseas? This is an important question. Very likely they saw it as a good career opportunity. Nevertheless, this hoped for career advancement wasn't always the case. In reality, sometimes the opposite effect occurred. Once returned to their original unit of administrative service, policemen would sometimes find that their promotions earned while serving in the colonies were not recognized. So now I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on the stories of two of the policemen, Jean Pourroy and Gaston Brod. And then after that, I will give some analysis about the significance of all this. Jean Pourroy, born in 1868 in Orsières in the Hautes-Alpes, first joined the police service in AOF in 1905. Served as commissaire de police in Conakry. He served in Conakry until 1930, turning down an offer to join the police in Cameroon in 1916, explaining that the cost of living was too high there and, quote, the difficulties of service much greater, unquote. As of 1913, Pourroy's brother was working on the railroad in Conakry. But if this was his incentive for overseas service, it was certainly not the only attraction. Far from Paris in Conakry, money problems followed Jean Pourroy. In 1908, the Société Crédit de la Place Clichy wrote the Colonial Ministry claiming that Pourroy owed them 236 francs. He denied the debt or any knowledge of the Société. Also in 1908, Monsieur L. Gandillon claimed a debt from Monsieur Pourroy and queried the ministry for his address. In 1914, Pourroy's ex-wife, Jean Véréchal, wrote to the Minister of Colonies asking for help in collecting money he owed for the support of their daughter. Pourroy had stopped paying a monthly sum of 100 francs to Véréchal to support their daughter, with Pourroy claiming, according to the ex-wife, that she was old enough to live without her father's support. No follow-up to the request of the ex-wife appears in the file, but it seems likely here, with the debts and the money owed for child support, likely that Pourroy sought escape from financial and personal problems in an overseas career. Gaston Brod, born in 1908 in Vesoul in the Haute-Saône, had worked in the Prefecture of Police in Paris since 1927 before engaging in the Colonial Police in Dakar as of 1930. Divorced with no children, Brod was also described in his earliest paperwork to the ministry as being typically without fortune. He had 20 months of experience in North Africa after the completion of his military service and was looking to expand his experience in the French Empire when he requested to be deployed to French West Africa in 1928. His apparently eager request not fulfilled, he asked in 1930 about employment in Indochina before being finally accepted by the police in AOF. Brod's request for an overseas position might show a desire for adventure, his willingness to go to Indochina or West Africa. Like Pourroy, however, Brod was also perhaps trying to escape his divorce. In 1931, the Minister of the Interior wrote to the Minister of Colonies that Madame Brod claims to be searching for her husband. That's quote, Madame Brod claims to be searching for her husband, and requested his address. He responded with a post office box address to be communicated to his former spouse. I suppose with the fear that she might show up in Dakar at his address. Brod attempted to use the colonies as an escape route one more time. In 1940, he retired but requested to resume his post in Dakar. He is a person that I was alluding to earlier who had who had gone back to Paris, found that he wasn't able to advance as he hoped he would, and requested to return to Dakar. Lefebvre, who was the director of the Sûreté Générale in Dakar, was very surprised to hear that Brod wanted to return, having seemed to be very eager to depart the colonies, and yet claimed that, again, a motive of escape could be at stake here. It was 1940, of course, and he wrote that, quote, "Certainly since his return to France, many events have occurred which could modify his point of view," unquote. So here seeing escape from the German occupation as another reason. So I will conclude in the next minute and explain how I see the backgrounds of the police as fitting into my overall argument. Police inspectors and commissaires were not trained in colonial administration, but self-selected from among the French police to undertake duties of policing in French West Africa. They came from working class backgrounds with modest educations. Politics likely played no role in their decisions to come to AOF, and probably little role in their activities as policemen. Nevertheless, a surprising possibility emerges from the lives of the police. Some of the police had perhaps more in common with the suspects they were trailing than with the Governor General. Some suspects, especially Europeans who engaged in extensive travel, charlatanism, or fraud, were seeking adventure and escape. So too were policemen like Pourroy and Brod, who sought out addresses that were difficult to trace, lives that could begin anew, and ways to flee from the mundane realities of divorce, money problems, or the oppression of foreign occupation. Might this common experience have compelled police inspectors to seek out similar characteristics among suspects? This is difficult to know. But it's interesting to imagine that police and suspects were part of the same group, that they both constituted elements of a European colonial society in flux, made up of people traveling back and forth from France to the colonies, seeking opportunities for reinvention. I would like to suggest that the fact that their own lives embody some of the messiness, some of the escape-oriented dubiousness of the so-called suspects provides further evidence of a colonial society difficult to control through simple categorization. Thank you.